Hi, this is Shonnie Lavender, the Conscious Moms Coach, and today I'm going to be talking with you about limit setting with our children. And first I'm going to start off by giving you some general information about limit setting and limits that I think will hopefully be thought-provoking for some of you because it's not something that we often think about with limits. So I'm going to do that first. Then I'm going to go into two approaches that you have with limit setting when your child, their reaction to your setting a limit in the first place is one of upset. They're not liking the limit. So I'm going to talk about the two approaches you have. And with all of this, I'm going to give you a couple of invitations because the way I approach my work with parents and families is that I have expertise and I have things to share, information and data and background and experience. And yet the best way to find out what works is to test things out in your family, experiment and play with things. So I'm going to have a couple invitations for you today as well. So let's get into it. So the first thing I want to do is talk about limits themselves and limit setting. So limits, though you're probably going to have an opinion on them, they are neither good nor bad. So they're not positive or negative. We have our opinions about them. We may like certain ones and dislike other ones. We may find them easy to set or hard to set, but that's all just our subjective experience. Objectively, limits are neither good nor bad. What matters is how we handle them as parents. So they are, in general, limits by what they are part of our experience as a human being, accepting that there are limits to our power and our control. So that's one of the functions that limits have, is they help us see that, oh, as strong as I am, as capable, as intelligent, as creative, whatever, the adjectives we want to put out there, that there are still limits to what I am able to do on my own power. So that is one of the functions of limits. They also teach us how to deal with emotional upset, because at some level, some time rather, all of us are going to have a negative reaction to a limit. Whether we're a child or an adult, we're going to be like, oh no, a limit, I don't want a limit. So we're going to have an emotional upset about a limit. And so limits, by their very nature, help us learn how to deal with our emotions. The third piece of the function of limits is they also help us discover when and how to advocate for ourselves. So there are going to be times, and you've experienced this in your adult life, or in your life now up to adulthood, is that there are times when we are going to accept limits and we're going to say, oh, that's a limit. That's just what it is. And there are other times where we're going to say, I don't accept this limit. I'm not willing to say that this is a limit. So limits also help us learn how and when we want to advocate for ourselves. So in my view, they're simply a natural part of life and they have many important functions. And again, what matters is how, as adults, we respond and the models that we set for our children, both in how we react when limits are set and we are having to deal with limits set for us, and also how we support them in their experience of having limits set on them. So that's one of the key things I want to share with limits, is just give you some food for thought. Like, oh yeah, it's neither good nor bad. It's just part of life. Now, I want to clarify limits now. And first I want to say that there are two types of limits. There are real limits and there are made up limits. And so this is a little bit like there are natural consequences and then there are consequences that adults dream up and call them logical consequences, but they're not. They're actually just made up consequences. So don't get me off track. And thanks for watching over on Instagram. So let me describe what I mean by the real limits and the made up limits. So real limits are those that happen outside of our conscious choosing. And when I say our, I'm talking about the adult. Okay, so as the parent, those limits are ones that we didn't consciously choose. So that might be something like a friend can or can't visit. We didn't choose it, but that's the reality. They can come over right now or they can't. They feel well or they're sick. That's a limit. Another one of those real limits is we don't have a certain food to eat at home, or we do. It's just what is. It's there or it's not. Now, we might have had some role in choosing whether it was there, but we're not going to get off track with that. We're simply going to say that that wasn't within our conscious choosing. It's just simply the reality of the situation. One more real limit, just to make sure you're getting clear on what I'm talking about, is like an event will or won't happen. So that party is happening or it's not. This event at school is happening or it's not. We're going to see grandma or we're not. It's within our choosing some of those events, but again, sometimes just circumstances happen. So those are real limits. The other type of limit that happens are those made up or parent created limits. And these are ones that we choose. Although I will say that we don't always have the same level of mindfulness with the limits that we choose. So let me give a little bit of background and then an example or two. So the parent created limits, these are based on our wishes as parents, our values, our beliefs, and our expectations, okay? So let me share a few examples of these. So a limit might be a certain time is bedtime or a certain time is waking up time. That's not an actual limit. That's one that we have decided as the parent, or we've decided as a family, however it is in your house. But nonetheless, it's a consciously chosen one. Needing to apologize or not. That might be something in your family that you do, that we have this expectation that when you do something that another person finds hurtful or harmful, that you apologize. That might be a limit that you set. You might have a limit around how much sugar your children eat or have access to. That can be another limit. You might limit access to devices, whether it's the device at all or a certain amount of time per day or certain types of content. So those are all examples of parent-created limits. And I hope that's a distinction for you. So again, the real limits are those that pretty much are just happening. They're out of our direct control for the most part. They're simply parts of life. They're time-based. They're reality-based. The parent-created limits are ones that we personally have said, this is a limit I want to have in our family, or this is a limit that I see as important for us to have now. So the final thing I want to say before I put an invitation to you and then I get into the responses that you can do when our children don't like the limits that we have set for them is I want to clarify something on the parent-created limits. I said that these are not always created with the same level of mindfulness. And what I mean by that is that some of those limits are based on beliefs. And beliefs, as you may or may not know, are mostly unconscious and are mostly not consciously chosen. Mostly our beliefs are those we've inherited from the families who raised us that we just took on as fact. You know, the world is a good place, the world is a bad place. People are mostly trustworthy, people are mostly not trustworthy. You know, whatever the beliefs are, most of them we just inherit. So as limits are concerned, what also happens is that we, many times without realizing it, we are simply setting limits because of things that we think we're supposed to be doing. Oh, my child should do this or shouldn't do that. And so we are setting these limits, so it's consciously chosen and yet not at that same level of thoughtfulness. So some are going to be, I want to really consider what kind of limits we want in our family. And others are going to be, well, this is just how we've always done it, and this is the way I expect it to be done. So that's a different level of consciousness. So that's what I was talking about when I said for parent-created limits, we do have different levels of mindfulness oftentimes when we have limits that we're choosing, so to speak. So here's my invitation to you at this point, is for the next few days, notice what kind of limits do you set? Are you mostly setting those real ones, and I say setting because you're not going to set the real ones, but are you voicing those and telling your child, here's this real world limit? Or are you mostly creating limits? There's no judgment, it's simply about noticing. Notice when you set them. So are you setting them in advance of a situation? So are you letting your child know these are going to be the limits that we're going to have? Or do you set them once something has started to happen and you think, oh, gotta have a limit here? Do you set them in the middle? Do you set them after you've reached some sort of limit and then you think, holy crap, I've got to put a limit in there, whatever it is. Again, no judgment, simply notice. Another thing I invite you to notice is why you set them. So again, are you consciously choosing them, or are you putting yourself in situations where you're really reacting to a lot of real life limits? For instance, If you're somebody who sometimes struggles to be on time, or maybe you're a procrastinator, you may find that you end up in situations where there are real life limits, like, oh, the time for that is past, or, oh, we missed our window for this. No judgment, simply a notice, like, oh yeah, I tend to set up situations that make real life limits more frequent. I don't know, but look at that as well. And then finally, and this is going to go into our second topic for today, is how do you handle your child's reactions when they dislike a limit? So that's my other invitation for you to notice. Just what goes on in you. Are you freaking out like, oh no, they don't like a limit, I gotta do something? Or are you like, how dare they don't accept this limit? Whatever it is, simply notice. That's my invitation for you for this point, is for the next week, notice limits and limit setting. What kind of limits you set, when you set them, why you set them, how you handle your children's reactions when they dislike a limit. Okay, so that's my invitation, and I'd love to hear from you in a week's time or a couple days' time, or if you're having this insight now of, hey, Shonnie, here's how I set limits a lot. I've just become aware of it. Feel free to pop it in a comment on Instagram or on Facebook or on YouTube for those of you who watch later. So that's my invitation for now. Let me now shift over to talking about, okay, you've set a limit and now your child is upset, right? They're mad, they're sad, they're frustrated, whatever they're upset. They are visibly not happy with the limit you have set. And so what can you do? So you have two options. So the approaches that you have when your child is upset about a limit that you have set, or that a limit that is, occurring in their world, you have two approaches. And so I want to talk to you about each of those and then give you some more invitations, some more things to practice and experiment with. So your first, these are not in priority, just the first one that I wrote down, is you can hold the limit. And so I'd encourage you personally, from my perspective as a parent coach, is to do this with limits that really need to be held, okay? And I say to be mindful of this because, again, we sometimes are, I was gonna say guilty, but we're not guilty, I don't like that word. We are setting limits, again, that don't always have big level of conscious choice behind them. They're just a reaction or just a thought about, oh, I have to do it this way. So really think about it. Okay, is this a limit that needs to be held? You get to decide that. I'm not going to judge it. It's your decision as the parent. Does this limit need to be held? And if you think so, then hold the limit. And so to hold the limit, just for those of you who don't know or always want more practice, I know I always like more practice because sometimes it's hard. So when you're holding a limit, what that means is that you are helping your child know that this is a limit. This is the way it is right now. We don't have this food, or it is bedtime, or we're gonna leave now, whatever it is. So you're holding that limit. What you're doing though, there's two really important pieces when you hold a limit. You're doing it lovingly. Now your loving ability may go up and down when you're having your own emotions. By and large, though, what you're striving for is really saying, I get it, this is the limit, though. It's just a line, and that's what it is. So you're going to hold that limit with love, and so you're going to state it that way the first time, and you're going to restate it that way. So you may say it 3 or 4 or 10 times, depending on how long your child's upset is. So this is the limit. I hear you, this is the limit. And the I hear you part is the second really important piece. When we hold a limit, part of this is that emotional piece that I talked about, the value of limits, is part of what the limit can do for your child is it can give them a nice vehicle. I say nice, it's not always fun for us as parents and not necessarily fun for our children, and yet it's still a good vehicle for them to have an emotional expression. Because our children, we forget this, but they have stress in their day. It's not the same stress that we have, but they have stress in their day. And so they have that stress build up, especially if they're in places like school and things where there's some big expectations about how they're supposed to behave. So they take the stresses of an interaction with another child at school, or an interaction with a teacher, or not understanding the work that is being asked of them, whatever the stresses are, not liking what you packed in their lunch, whatever it is, they have those stresses and they don't always get to process them in the moment. And so a limit can be a great vehicle for them now to have this, I don't like it, I'm mad, I'm sad, I'm so upset with you people. Whatever their reaction is, it's a great vehicle to help them get that emotional expression out. And they need that because you don't want to have those emotions stuck inside you. So it may seem like their upset is about the limit you've set, and it may be, or it may simply be, this was the catalyst for all the rest of their pent-up emotions to be able to come out. So they're raging, or they're crying, or they're screaming, or they're pleading, maybe actually something that's carried over from another part of their day. So you really want to empathize with them. Yeah, I know you really want to stay. I know it would be so nice to stay up. It's so hard. Sleeping seems so boring compared to playing with your toys. Sleeping seems so boring compared to, being on your iPad, whatever it is. So you're empathizing. You are taking their experience as 100% valid and true, because it is true for them. So you're empathizing, you're loving, and you're holding that limit. I get it, and here's the limit. I know you want another piece of cake, and you've had enough. You're not going to have another piece of cake. So sometimes it's going to happen quick. Sometimes you're going to set it. They're going to have some upset. You might restate it once, empathize with them, hold them, let them scream at you, let them cry, whatever their expression is, and then they're done. Sometimes there was an example. I was listening to Hand in Hand's podcast recently, and one of the hosts was talking about an experience with somebody she was working with. The child had an upset about a limit that took 2 hours for the upset to really be fully processed. So you're not always going to be willing to do that, and that's okay. I'm not always willing to do that either. But that's what it looks like to hold a limit. Is you set the limit, you empathize. You restate the limit, you empathize. You restate the limit, you empathize. You are that loving container for that child to express their emotions around this limit or other things in their life that they are upset about. Okay, so that's holding the limit. So that's one option. Your first option can be your second. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. The second option that you have is you can change the limit. And this one, I'm going to say a little bit more about it in just a moment. I'm inviting you, though, when you think about changing the limit, be mindful about the actual reality of the situation. So that's you, that's your child, that's the environment. So be mindful of what's really true and happening in that moment. And I'll give you a real life example from my life that I think will clarify that. So you can change any part of the limit. So you can change a big part of it, the whole limit. You can, remove it entirely. You can change a little part of the limit. It's totally up to you. So this is where you're saying, I've rethought this. I'm reconsidering. I see some new information that I didn't see before, or I have a different perspective than I have when I said it 2 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago. Whenever you decide to change it, you can change the limit. So here's the example from my own life. Is my daughter's 8, and this was probably earlier in the summer, so probably 2 months ago. And she mostly had been taking baths, but we've been switching over fairly frequently to showers when she bathes. So we were moving over to showers, and one day she was taking a shower, and what she was liking to do at that time was she liked to put the stopper on the tub so that the tub would be filling up with water as well. And I felt really irritated about this. I was like, it's dirty water. Don't fill up the tub. And so I noticed that I was saying to her, like, okay, pull up the stopper. You need to let the tub drain. The tub's supposed to drain. And I was really getting pretty weird about it, in my opinion. And so finally I was like, does the tub stopper have to be up? It's like, I just had this thought, like, wait a minute, is that an actual thing? And I decided that was not an actual thing. I had my stuff about it. Yes, that's true. But that was not actually a limit that I needed to set. And so I said to my daughter, I was like, yeah, put the drain back down or whatever. Or she had put it back down. And, you know, I didn't say anything more about it because I realized it was like, it's not a big deal. Now, I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but I decided for me in that moment that that was me having unconsciously set a limit based on some weird stuff in me, that then upon reflection, I went, that really isn't a limit that I want to set. And so I just removed it, like, yeah. And so now sometimes when she takes a shower, she has the thing blocked. And it's like, it's not an issue anymore. So incredibly freeing to do that. So you're not going to be able to do that or be willing to do that with every limit. And yet I'm inviting you to really, when you think about a limit that you've set and your child is now upset, think about, wait, why is this limit here? Does this really make sense? Do I really want to do it? Do I really care? Why do I care? So that's actually my invitation. I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. So my invitation to you is this next week, besides the other thing that you're going to be working on, is to notice what approach do you normally take. So when your child gets upset, you've set a limit. When your child gets upset, do you normally tend to hold the limit or do you normally tend to change the limit? Again, no judgment, just notice. Do I change it? Do I hold it? Secondly, look for the reason why. So why are you holding it? What's that driving thought behind, I have to hold it because ... What's the end of that sentence? Or I better change it because ... So why are you motivated to either hold it or change it? And then the third invitation is to experiment with taking the other approach and notice how it is for you and your child. So really simply experiment and see, oh, you know what? I can actually do this one. And then, oh, I did it and oh, it felt so hard. Or I stumbled a little bit and then I got the hang of it. You know, whatever it is, simply notice, oh, I experimented and here's what happened for me. So that's my invitation for this part of this talk. Let me close up by saying a few more things, and then I'm going to check in for any comments and questions before I sign off. So talk today about limits, what they are, what they function as, how they support us as human beings. I also talked about two different and distinct types of limits. And then I talked about two approaches to dealing with your child's upset when you have set a limit. Okay, so that's sort of a recap. So if you joined at some point in the video, go back and watch the rest of it. What I want to say in conclusion, though, is that limits, we do have some problems with limits and limit setting. But here's when it's problematic, is when limit setting becomes something we do in a mindless way. So when we just are spouting off, here's this limit, like I was doing with the bathtub thing. Oh, you know, the drain has to be open. Well, yeah, if it's flowing over the top of the tub, that's true. But beyond that, no, that was me setting a mindless limit. So when we set them mindlessly, they cause problems. When we get stuck in a pattern, so all of us have our tendencies. So some people are, I'm going to set lots of limits. Other people are like, I don't like to set limits. That can be problematic when it's just this thing that, well, this is how I do it. Be mindful of that. And so if you get stuck in a pattern, that's something to look at and explore. Is that pattern really serving you and your children? Or is it time to break up that pattern? So you can still do it, just not as a pattern, not as a habit. And then the third reason or time that limit setting gets problematic is then when we make the limit or limit setting about more than it really is. So for example, what I mean by this is this idea, you hear this in mainstream parenting. It's like, you have to, you know, your kids have to learn that you're in charge and what you say goes, and you have to hold a line, otherwise they'll walk all over you, or they won't accept authority, they won't accept boundaries. That's not what it's about. Now, if you habitually set a limit and then don't have it, you know, you say, oh, bedtime is now, and then you don't do it. And if that's what you do with 99.9% of your life, then the challenge there is that's about you. That's really not about the limit setting. That's about what's happening for you that's causing you to make that your habit. But the limits are just things. It's how we deal with them. It's what we do with what we notice about how we set them, why we don't set them. That's where the real gifts are. And so I invite you to embrace limit setting, not because it's something that I've got to make my child understand it. Embrace it because it is part of life, and there's some real gifts in it for you and for your child. So I hope this talk has been thought-provoking for you and gives you some ideas, gives you some things to play with, to look at, to look for. So please feel free to give me your comments and your questions after you've experimented and after you've thought through this. I would love to continue this conversation with you. My name is Shonnie Lavender. I'm the Conscious Moms Coach. And as I said at the top of the video, you can find me on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook, in my Facebook group, the Conscious Mom Circle, and on my website, shonnielavender.com. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I'll look forward to connecting with you again very soon. Take care.